Hey Bio 30s, I'm back again for another lesson. Today we will be discussing the parts and structure of the eye. I tried to think of a joke about the eye, but they just kept getting cornea and cornea. So we will get into the parts of the eye. To begin, here is our eye diagram. So there are a lot of parts here, but we're going to try and break it down kind of like piece by piece, and then after we go through the parts, I'll discuss how they actually all work together in the process of vision. So when we look at the parts of the eye, we start off here with our vitreous humor, cornea, lens, pupil, aqueous humor, iris, ciliary muscles, retina, choroid layer, arteries and veins, fovea centralis, optic nerve, the blind spot, and the sclera. So I'll go back to this diagram in a little bit, but first thing we'll talk about is the outer coating of the eye, which is the sclera. So the eye is made of essentially three layers. There's the outer layer, which is the sclera. There's the middle layer, which is the choroid, and then there's the inner layer, which is the retina. So the main job of the sclera is it's the white part of the eye. So we see here in the diagram, or in the image here, there's your whites of your eye, that's your sclera. And it is the protective outer layer of the eye. So it maintains the eye shape, it is protective. The other layers are a lot more sensitive, so they're covered up by the sclera. Now you'll notice that yes, the sclera is white, but of course the covering that goes over your pupil needs to be clear for obvious reasons, and that is called the cornea. So the cornea is a clear covering that goes over your pupil as well as your iris. Now if anyone's ever experienced a scratched cornea, it's not a fun time because there's a lot of nerve endings in your cornea. So it's really not fun. Now the cornea is there to basically keep things out of your eye, but also allow light in. So the thing is, obviously we can't have a layer directly behind the cornea because that's going to block light. But the cornea still needs things like oxygen and nutrients and to keep it moist. So we have something called the aqueous humor. So the aqueous humor is essentially a little, it's essentially just a little transparent fluid directly behind the cornea, and it's going to supply it with things like oxygen and nutrients and make sure that cornea is good and healthy. Now the next layer is the choroid layer, and this contains your arteries and your veins. So for every other part of your eye, you get your oxygen and your nutrients from the choroid layer because that's where you find your arteries and your veins. Part of the choroid layer is the iris, which is the colored part of your eye. Not only is it your eye color, which is pretty cool, it actually does have a job. It can actually change the size of the pupil. So it can either dilate it or constrict it, depending on how much light you want to allow into the eye. Directly behind the pupil, so the pupil would be the opening into the eye, directly behind the pupil would be the lens. And the lens's job is to focus light directly onto the retina. And then attached to the lens, we have muscles known as ciliary muscles. They can actually flatten or curve your lens depending on if you're looking at something close up or far away. Now the eyeball itself is kind of like a roundish oblong shape, and it's full of fluid as well, and that fluid is called vitreous humor. So vitreous humor is also clear, so it's going to let light through, and it's going to be able to maintain the shape of the eyeball. And then our third layer is probably the most important one when we talk about sight. It would be the retina. So the retina is made of two main photoreceptors, rods and cones. Think cones, C for color. And what a photoreceptor is a specialized sensory receptor. So it's a specialized sensory receptor that is attached to a sensory neuron. And these particular receptors respond to light. So when light hits a rod or a cone, it creates an action potential, and then that action potential is sent up to the brain. So rods are more for your low intensity, your black, whites, grays, those would be what your rods are used for, and you have lots of rods, all kind of on the outer ridges of your retina. And then you also have cones, which are more for high intensity light, like color. That's where you're gonna process your color. So when it comes to your rods and your cones, like I said, they're both sensory receptors. And they're going to, once excited, send a message through bipolar cells, which are sensory neurons, through the optic nerves, which are also sensory neurons, up into the central nervous system where we find our interneurons. Now the fovea centralis, think C centralis, C for color, this is where we're going to find our cones. So the majority of your cones are going to be found in the fovea centralis. So when the light is focused from the lens, it's going to hit the fovea centralis, activate our cones, activate our rods, and send that signal to the brain. Now the rods, once again, are kind of around the fovea, so they're kind of on the outer edges of your retina. So they also help with peripheral vision as well, so the vision up kind of like the sides of your eyes. And then finally, we do have a spot where we don't have any rods or cones, and that's where the optic nerve joins to the retina. Because if we think about it, I'll go back to our first diagram and kind of go over the whole pathway here. So if you think about light, right? So let's say light is coming in from all different directions. So light is coming in from all these different directions. It's going to first go in through your cornea, past your aqueous humor, and then enter in through your pupil. Now, once light enters in through your pupil, it's going to hit your lens. So there's your lens right there. And once again, the iris can change the shape of the pupil. If you want to let in more light, less light, if it's dim, if it's intense. You know, this might explain why if it's really, really dark, you got wide pupils to let in more light so you can see a little bit better. If it's really, really bright, your pupils constrict to let in less light so you don't damage your retinas. So once light hits the lens, it's going to then be focused to this very back spot here, which is your fovea centralis. So that's where you find your cones and then the rods around it. That's going to create an action potential. Now what we want is our action potential to always move in one direction. So it's going to start here, continue along here, and then up your optic nerve. Your blind spot is right here, right in the middle of that pathway. So we don't want rods or cones in the middle of that pathway. It's going to interfere with our signal, which we really, really don't want. So that's what your blind spot is. It's essentially a spot where your optic nerve joins your retina and you wouldn't find any rods or cones there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the difference between rods and cones. So once again, rods are used for low intensity, dim lighting, blacks, whites, shades of grays, but cones need high intensity light. So rods are really, really sensitive. Like one photon could activate a rod. So like one photon would be enough to open sodium channels and create an action potential. For your cones, they're a little bit more, they take a little bit more light energy. They take a little bit higher intensity photons. So for your cones, you have three different kinds of cones. You have red, you have blue, and you have green. And between the three of them, they can make up all the spectrum of visible light that we see. So when you activate your reds, your blues, and your greens, the light hits your cones, activates them, and there has to be enough light or high intensity light to activate them. Now, sometimes we run into issues where we have color blindness, and the most common type of color blindness is actually red-green color blindness. And this is usually it's a problem with your reds or your greens, or it could be a problem that you don't have enough of these cones. And what happens is your body or your brain gets confused and has a hard time distinguishing between reds and greens. Christmas ends up being a nightmare for these people. So it's really, really common, and actually later on we'll talk maybe as we get into genetics, we'll talk about why it affects males more than females. It's actually found on the X chromosome, so it tends to affect males a lot more than females. But you see here, someone who would have red-green color blindness would have difficulty distinguishing the numbers in there, right? So they have difficulty distinguishing the 2 and the 7 because they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. So that's the most common type of color blindness, is red-green color blindness. So I kind of went over this a little bit, but I'll go over it again here. So we start off with the action potential in our rods and our cones. Bipolar cells, they're essentially like a connector cell. So they're going to connect to ganglion cells, which are going to bundle together and form your optic nerve. One optic nerve running from each eye will then enter the thalamus. Remember from the last lesson, the thalamus is our relay center in our brain. And then it's going to relay that message to the occipital lobe of our brain. In the occipital lobe of our brain, we're going to have our primary visual cortex. So I'll show you where that is here. So that's at the very back here in your occipital lobe. It's going to process what we see. And then we're going to have our association, where we associate what we see with a word. So for example, right, you would process this image and you associate it with the word stapler. That's how your brain works. Now, the thing with sight is actually binocular, meaning we use both of our eyes to see. So what happens is there's a area just below your brain where the optic nerves actually cross. So what happens is your right eye connects to your right brain and your left eye connects to your left brain. But what also happens is the nerve tracks will cross, so information from the right eye also goes to the left brain, information from the left eye also goes to the right brain. So both sides of your brain get information from both eyes, which is really important. Now, when we actually see the image, right? So the image we're actually looking at in the back of our eye is actually smaller, upside down, and reversed. So how that works is the top of the light from this rose would hit the bottom of our retina. The bottom of the rose would actually hit the top of our retina. So what ends up happening is the image that is produced needs to be flipped in our brain. So our brain needs to flip what we're actually seeing, because really when it's hitting the retina, it's smaller, upside down, and in an inverse position. Now we can actually accommodate what we see based on if an object is close up or far away. So if an object is far away, what's going to happen is our ciliary muscles are going to relax. This will pull on the lens and flatten it. This will allow more light to enter into our eye. The lens will flatten and will make sure that light gets to our fovea. Also, when we're looking at something far away, our pupils are going to dilate to allow in more light. If we're looking at something close up, our ciliary muscles are going to contract. This will actually round our lens, so our lens will become round because we're focusing on something close up. And our pupils will actually constrict because we're focusing on that image that's close up. So maybe we're looking at a picture or reading a book, and we want to block out what else is coming in, the light coming in. We just want to focus on that one thing. Now, when it comes to eye disorders, right? An astigmatism is one of the most common eye disorders you can have, and really all it is it's an uneven cornea. So I have an astigmatism in my left eye. I like to make the joke that it just means my contacts and glasses are super expensive, but really what it means is that my cornea in my left eye is not shaped properly. So when light hits my cornea, it's not going to hit my fovea properly. So I need a special lens to correct that, to make sure that light does hit my fovea, or else it's very hard to see out of that eye. Another issue you might have with your eye is glaucoma. So glaucoma is where pressure builds up in the eye. So what ends up happening is there's these little tiny ducts that drain fluid from your eye. If they were to get plugged or clogged, they can actually build up, and pressure will build up within the eye. Now what happens is if the pressure pushes and pushes and pushes and pushes on your optic nerve, it can damage nerve cells, even cause them to die, which eventually could lead to blindness if this isn't taken care of. Cataracts also occur later on in life where the lens becomes clouded. You can have cataract surgery to remove the cataracts, or if they keep coming back or they are severe enough, you may end up getting very strong glasses, or you may actually just have the lens removed altogether. So some people just have their lens removed and they get really, really strong glasses, or they have a plastic lens put in as well. And these last two here, these are just, also common eye disorders. Nearsightedness or farsightedness, really the two most common reasons why people would need glasses. So for me personally, I'm nearsighted. I'm able to focus on things close up, although not that close because my prescription is not great. So I have an astigmatism in my left eye, and then I'm also nearsighted. So I have difficulty seeing things far away. So what happens in my eyes is that my eyeball is actually too long. My eyeball is elongated. So what happens is the light doesn't reach my fovea. So the light doesn't reach my fovea. So I need a special concave lens to bend light. So I'm wearing contacts right now. So my contacts are concave that will bend light to make sure it hits my fovea. For someone who's farsighted, you can actually see close up, you can see far away. You have trouble seeing close up. So this might be someone who would put on glasses to read. They actually have a shorter eyeball, so the light actually goes past their fovea, past their focal point, so they need a convex lens to correct that. And then some people need something called bifocals, where they would need two different prescriptions in their glasses, one for far away and one for close up. And there is something called trifocals, where you actually have 3 prescriptions, one for far away, one for kind of medium distances, and then one for close up. So that's essentially the parts of the eye, how we see, and a few eye disorders. Next lesson, we're going to talk about the parts of the ear, how we hear, and a few ear disorders. So thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.